Hi, my name is Meghan Harms. I'm a doctoral student at Athabasca University and also a practicing chartered accountant. Today I'm going to present on my paper, which is a work in progress, Canada Revenue Agency as Gatekeeper to Economic Citizenship, the Case of Canadian Sex Workers. And as is convention, when we are addressing any paper or work that deals with marginalized populations, I feel it is appropriate to give a positionality statement. I self-identify as someone with lived experience in the sex trade. And even though I am not currently involved in that vocation, I am a legacy member of that community and I have deep ties and roots to that community. So when I speak about the sex trade, I do it from a position of relative intimacy and certainly not detachment. So, how do we determine who is a business person? When we look at these two slides, would we say that these two groups of individuals are equally eligible to be considered business people? This is when we look into the question of what is economic citizenship. Well, economic citizenship describes a relationship. It describes the method of fiscal exchange between the individual and the state. It describes a belonging and it describes a series of obligations. So when we interfere with individual's ability to participate in the full spectrum of the citizen taxpayer exchange, we essentially obstruct their claims to full economic citizenship. And we recognize that certain individuals in society may not receive equal benefits because of this. So what does it mean to be a citizen? Well, there's various definitions of what citizenship is. We can look at legal, social, economic citizenship. Here we're really looking at economic and tax citizenship. So citizenship grants a generalized reciprocity between the individual and the state. The individual has entitlements to rights and services, medical care, EI, CPP, social assistance, uh, participation in the conventional banking system, just to start off. To receive those entitlements to rights and services, the citizen has certain obligations to the state. They need to file and pay taxes and they need to abide by the law. But what if certain individuals cannot accurately declare and file their taxes? What if there is no instruction for them on how to do so? Then we have an obstruction in the citizen taxpayer exchange. We find that sex workers in particular receive tremendous ambiguity in terms of how to achieve tax compliance, therefore obstructing their participation in full economic citizenship. So all this talk about sex workers, we should probably define who they are in the Canadian context. Sex workers are understood as a diverse group of workers whose labor straddles both legal and economic ambiguities. Sex work has been historically considered to be an informal market. It does function between informality and formality in present day. Sex workers can be anyone, so they're persons of diverse class, race, gender, ethnicity. Sex work has a two-part main taxonomy, two main categories of sexual labor. So in person, which can be further broken down into exotic dancers, escorts, body rub practitioners, outdoor workers, and then there's the digital sex work economy, which is OnlyFans, webcam models, adult film. These do not comprise all of the different varieties of sex work. There's a lot under that umbrella, but those are some main examples just to conceptualize what a sex worker is. So sex workers are discriminated against. They face a lot of social stigma. This is very well developed within literature, academically, in the Canadian context, in the North American context, in the global context. This is an established concept, is that sex workers worldwide face discrimination and general subjugation socially. Now, this is in spite of sex work being legal in Canada for the seller. So we function in Canada under the Nordic model, and this is explained in my paper, where sex work is legal for the seller, criminalized for the buyer, and this extends to give the sex workers even the ability to self-incorporate. I can only speak to the BC and Ontario jurisdictions, but the Law Society has confirmed that sex workers working independently for themselves, not under duress, can incorporate. What is the Canada Revenue Agency? Well, they exist without need for much explanation. They are administrators of the Income Tax Act. They are not authors of the legislation, and they are extremely powerful with a great degree of political interdependency. I don't think that I need to explain to many Canadians the level of urgency that Revenue Canada can demand and the monopoly jurisdiction they have over our nation's income tax affairs. So if compliance in an income tax system is part of this generalized reciprocity that lends itself to tax citizenship, then by extension, anything that obstructs a person's participation in tax compliance would be an obstruction to their full economic citizenship. So other academics have suggested that taxation is the nexus of identity confirmation. Cohort has found similar behavior by the tax authorities over in Italy, whereby the tax authority gave sex workers various answers in terms of their tax compliance requirements, inconsistent information, ambiguous information, and really excluded sex workers from normative business discourse. CRA seems to be doing the same thing. They, in direct correspondence, will confirm that sex work income is subject to income tax and GST, HST if you write into Rulings Directorate as a professional and specifically ask the question. However, there has been no information circulars, no publications, no guides published. In my paper, I review the number of publications and the diversity of the publications that CRA gives to the Canadian public as part of this reciprocal exchange to ensure that different business types can achieve tax compliance. Crypto is a great example. Crypto has transitioned from an informal economy towards the formal economy. So CRA has changed the tax schedules to accommodate for the reporting of cryptocurrency transactions. They have also authored and published a significant amount of publications in order to assist taxpayers in becoming compliant in this regard. We find a direct absence of this in the context of all forms of sexual labor. So taxation can become a site of identity construction. If you can't compliantly file a small business schedule, are you a business person? Even more importantly, Revenue Canada is a monopoly authority on issuing income confirmation documents like notices of assessment. So if you cannot file a tax return, or there's barriers to you accurately filing a tax return, then you do not get a notice of assessment. And if you are going to get financing in any form or participate in a fulsome way in our economy at all, then you require a notice of assessment. So other examples in my paper: sex workers' exclusion from the North American Industry Classification System. Cohort speaks to this in her latest work, where she describes a tax imaginary. It's like, who can we imagine to be a taxpayer? Who can we imagine to be a business person? So it's a prescriptive process where social actors judge who is deserving of taxpayer status, who is deserving of the status of a business person. And Crowhurst's work suggests that there is a direct correlation between one's participation in the tax system and paying their fair share towards unseating narratives of being a state leech or a layabout or other negative connotations that we give to people that we feel are not fulfilling the social contract in terms of taxation exchange. With evidence suggesting that sex work is becoming a more prolific part of the Canadian economy, we would expect that CRA may feel some pressure to keep pace with the transition from the informal to formalized economy. Stakeholder theory allows us to understand a little bit why they don't feel so motivated. We can conceptualize sex workers as urgent and legitimate claimants, but they do not have power. So without this power, sex workers find themselves as expectant, independent stakeholders. They're essentially waiting around for the CRA to make changes. There's not a real lot of influential lobbying work being done to the CRA. Really, grassroots nonprofit sex worker organizations are putting some pressure on them, but again, they do not have a lot of power. The CRA is a dangerous stakeholder capable of exercising its power in urgent and demanding ways without sufficient legitimacy or accountability. In my paper, I talk a lot about the enmeshment between CRA and the federal government and how they really intersect each other in so many ways. We do not have a taxation that is removed from legislative authority. So the power imparted on the CRA is really quite great. And as such, they don't really have much incentive to cater to marginalized populations if they feel that there is an element of political risk in doing so. Resource dependency theory also gives us a good clue as to why this phenomenon is occurring. So the CRA is a monopoly authority over tax and social benefit resources. Again, as described, they are the only body that can issue a notice of assessment. So they are not incentivized in any way to make alterations to their practices unless there is sufficient pressure to unseat their power. And at this time, sex workers do not have sufficient powerful claims to do that. They have legitimate claims, but they do not have powerful enough claims to unseat this monopoly. So if we want to change the tax imaginary of sex work, if we want to shift the public perception of sex workers away from this really informalized, stigmatized identity and transition it more towards like these individuals are business people, they can be business people, they're contributing to the fiscal exchange. They are contributing and participating in economic citizenship, then we need buy-in from Revenue Canada. We need certain resources from CRA. And my paper argues that these resources are currently not being provided. So I want to thank you for listening to my presentation today. And generally, this is the point where I open the floor for questions for me. But I have some questions for you if you want to participate. This is part of my initial stages of my dissertation work, and now I'm at a crossroads about where to go with this. It's sort of the classic qualitative versus quantitative argument. Number one, I can interview Canadian sex workers about their experiences with tax compliance and business self-efficacy. And that would be a largely qualitative study, probably some grounded theory work, and would publish with the intention of essentially creating a social case for the Canada Revenue Agency to change their practices. The second option is quantitative work, so gathering data to extrapolate the estimated tax gap on informal sex work economies in Canada. So this would be data gathering. I would have to choose a particular taxonomy of sex workers. It would probably be indoor full service workers. Determine a median income, and then determine an estimate of how many sex workers are currently working in Canada, and then extrapolate that, and then back out the projected tax gap from those revenues. And then present that to the CRA as a business case argument as to why there should be inclusion and inviting in of sex workers into tax and business discourse. So I just look forward to your comments on that. Thank you.